Gabriel Moretti had all the power in Chicago's underworld, but for 3 years he felt completely empty. Ever since his wife was murdered in a brutal ambush by a rival gang, the Mafia boss had turned his mansion into a fortress, killing anyone who threatened his empire without hesitation, yet nothing could fill the void in his chest. Until one day, he noticed something strange about Amelia, the silent maid who had been working in his mansion for 5 years. The 27-year-old woman who scrubbed his floors and washed his clothes was pregnant, her belly already swollen. Yet she had never mentioned having a boyfriend or any family. Gabriel began watching her more closely. He noticed how she hid her morning sickness, how her hands trembled whenever he walked past, how she avoided looking into his eyes as if terrified of what he might see. One night, when Amelia left the mansion wearing her worn-out coat and carrying her old black bag, Gabriel did something he had never done before. He followed her, and what he discovered did not just bring the ruthless Mafia king to his knees, it shattered everything he thought he knew and changed his life forever. If you want to hear the rest of this story, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this video with someone who loves dramatic stories. Now let us continue with the secret that Amelia had been hiding for 5 years. Gabriel Moretti was not an ordinary crime boss. He was the crownless king of Chicago's underworld, a man whose name alone was enough to make even the most hardened figures lower their heads. The Moretti empire stretched across the city like a vast spiderweb, controlling every underground casino from the poorest neighborhoods to the most exclusive clubs reserved for the elite. They trafficked weapons through transnational networks and laundered money through dozens of shell companies perfectly disguised as legitimate businesses. People said that not a single bullet was fired in Chicago without Gabriel knowing. Not a single stream of dirty money flowed through the city without him taking his share. The Moretti family had built this empire over 3 generations, but it was Gabriel who lifted it to a height of power never seen before. His mansion stood in the northern suburbs of Chicago, a massive structure covering more than 2,000 square meters, surrounded by walls 3 meters high. Surveillance cameras watched every corner, motion sensors ran along the perimeter, and a team of 24 bodyguards stood watch day and night. The main gate was forged from solid steel, so heavy it required hydraulic engines to open. Beneath the mansion lay an underground safe room designed to withstand bombs and gunfire, where Gabriel kept his most critical documents and an armory large enough to equip an entire squad. After Isabella's death, he turned a home once filled with laughter into a cold fortress, a place where even sunlight struggled to pass through the thick curtains that were always drawn shut. In the underworld, the name Gabriel Moretti was synonymous with merciless cruelty. He was infamous for the punishments he reserved for traitors, stories so disturbing that merely hearing them was enough to rob people of sleep for nights on end. Some claimed he had personally severed each finger of an informant before allowing the man one final look at his family. Others whispered that he had buried alive someone who dared to tamper with the family's goods without a flicker of emotion crossing his face. Whether truth or rumor, no one dared confirm it, yet that very uncertainty allowed fear to spread even further. Gabriel didn't need to kill many people. He only needed to kill the right person, in the right way, to make the entire underworld tremble. But behind that ice-cold exterior was a man slowly dying from the inside. Isabella's bedroom remained untouched, preserved exactly as it had been when she was alive. The perfumes she loved were still lined up on the vanity, their scents long faded, yet Gabriel wouldn't allow anyone to move them. Her wardrobe still held the dresses she used to wear, the high heels she once walked in. Even the silk scarf she had draped over her shoulders on that fateful morning still rested on the back of a chair. He ordered the house staff to clean the room every day, but forbade them from touching anything that belonged to her. It was his way of keeping Isabella there, even if only as an illusion. Every night, when the mansion sank into silence and the guards changed shifts, Gabriel sat alone in his study with a bottle of expensive whiskey and their wedding photograph placed on the desk. He stared into Isabella's eyes in the picture, remembering her laughter, remembering the way she spoke his name every morning when she woke, remembering the promises they once made about a small family filled with the sound of children running through the house. Those promises had turned to ashes. He drank until his throat burned, until her image blurred in the haze of alcohol, until he could pretend he no longer felt anything at all. Yet when morning came, the emptiness in his chest was still there, deep and aching like a wound that would never heal. For 3 years, Gabriel Moretti had lived like a walking corpse. He still ran the empire, still gave orders to kill, still counted money and expanded territory, but it was all nothing more than the momentum of a machine that had lost its soul. He couldn't remember the last time he laughed. He couldn't remember what it felt like to look forward to a new day. For Gabriel, each day was only a meaningless repetition of the one before it, a long chain of hours he endured before returning to his bottle and the photograph of the woman he had lost. Isabella's death was a wound time could never heal. 3 years ago, on a clear October afternoon, with not a single cloud in the sky, Isabella decided to go shopping on her own. She wanted to find decorations for a room she planned to turn into a nursery. Just 1 week earlier, the doctor had confirmed she was 2 months pregnant. After so many years of failed fertility treatments, after countless nights of crying and despair, the miracle had finally arrived. Gabriel clearly remembered the radiant look on her face when she told him the news, remembered how she placed his hand on her belly even though there was nothing yet to feel, remembered her whispering that they were about to have a complete family. He had promised to protect her and their child with his life. That promise became the most bitter lie of his existence. Isabella never made it home that afternoon. She was ambushed in the middle of a crowded street, on a road less than 100 meters from the shopping center. The Russo gang, a long-standing rival of the Moretti family, had been tracking her routine for weeks. They knew exactly when she left the mansion, which car she drove, where she would stop. 4 gunmen on 2 motorcycles closed in on Isabella's sedan the moment she exited the parking lot. They opened fire without mercy. More than 30 bullets tearing through the windshield, through the reinforced doors, through the fragile body of a woman carrying a small life inside her. Isabella died on the spot, her eyes still wide open, staring up at the deep blue sky she would never see again. When Gabriel received the news, he was in a meeting with his associates. The phone rang, Marco reported in a trembling voice, and Gabriel's world collapsed completely. He couldn't remember how he drove to the scene, couldn't remember how many police officers he shoved aside to reach his wife's body. He only remembered holding Isabella in his arms, her blood soaking his white shirt, her body growing cold as he screamed her name amid the crowd. He couldn't cry. The tears seemed frozen in his chest, replaced by a roar ripping from his throat like the cry of a mortally wounded beast. The medical examiner later confirmed that Isabella was pregnant when she was murdered. Gabriel didn't just lose his wife. He lost the child who never had the chance to be born. He lost the future they had dreamed of for so many years. What followed was the bloodiest week in the history of Chicago's underworld. Gabriel Moretti, a man already known for his ruthlessness, became a demon with no concept of mercy. He mobilized the entire family force, placing an enormous bounty on any information about the Russo gang. Within 72 hours, he had identified every person involved in the ambush and their locations. Then the slaughter began. Gabriel personally tortured the 4 gunmen who had fired into Isabella's car, forcing them to die slowly in unbearable pain over many days before granting them release. He wiped out the entire Russo family, sparing no one, from the aging boss to the newest recruits. Warehouses, casinos, and Russo businesses were burned to ashes. Anyone who had ever done business with Russo received a clear message written in blood and fire. 1 week after Isabella's funeral, the Russo gang no longer existed. The name Russo was erased from Chicago's underworld as if it had never been there at all. Gabriel Moretti had taken his revenge. But what did that victory mean when he still woke every night in an empty room, when every morning he still forgot that Isabella was gone, when every moment he still heard her laughter echoing through the cold corners of the house? He had killed dozens, bathed his enemies in blood, turned his pain into a fury that burned everything in its path. But when the flames died down, when the blood dried, Isabella still didn't return. And Gabriel realized that revenge couldn't fill the void she left behind. It only dragged him deeper into the darkness. While Gabriel Moretti sank deeper into the darkness of his loss, there was another woman enduring her own private hell beneath his roof. Amelia Torres wasn't born to be a maid, and she certainly wasn't born to become a debt slave for the most brutal Mafia family in Chicago. She once had dreams, once had hope, once believed that life would treat good people fairly. Fate taught her a bitter lesson that fairness was a luxury reserved for the powerful, while the poor like her could only bow their heads and endure. Amelia's father, Carlos Torres, had once been a skilled mechanic with golden hands capable of fixing any machine. He loved his wife, loved his daughter, and worked himself to exhaustion to support his small family in a cramped apartment in the poor southern part of the city. Then gambling destroyed him like a cancer quietly eating away from the inside. It began with small card games among co-workers and escalated into endless nights in underground casinos, where he wagered an entire month's wages in the hope of winning back what he had lost. He lost, again and again, and each time he believed that just one more hand would turn his luck around. It never did. When loans from friends and relatives dried up, Carlos Torres made the most foolish decision of his life. He borrowed money from the Moretti family, $200,000 at a crushing interest rate he could never repay. He gambled it all away within 3 months, losing every last dollar at a blackjack table in a casino controlled by the Morettis themselves. When debt collectors began appearing at his door, When they threatened to cut off his fingers and then move on to his wife and daughter, Carlos Torres chose the solution of a coward. He hanged himself in an abandoned warehouse near their home, leaving behind an enormous debt and a shame that could never be washed away. Amelia was only 22 at the time, freshly graduated from a community college with an accounting degree and an entire future ahead of her. She found her father's body in the warehouse, his eyes still wide open, his tongue swollen and purple, a crumpled suicide note in his pocket. He apologized, said he loved his wife and daughter, said this was the only way to free them. He was wrong. His death freed no one. It only pushed Amelia and her mother into a deeper abyss. The Moretti family didn't forgive unpaid debts, even when the debtor was dead. They came to Amelia and offered her a cruel choice. Either she worked for them to repay her father's debt, or they would collect it in other ways no one wanted to imagine. Amelia had no choice. She signed the agreement she knew was no different from selling herself, agreeing to work without pay in Gabriel Moretti's mansion until the debt was erased. With interest piled upon interest, she calculated she would have to work at least 15 years, maybe longer, maybe for the rest of her life. Fate still didn't release her. Just 1 year after Amelia began working at the mansion, her mother was diagnosed with stage 3 lung cancer. Maria Torres needed chemotherapy, needed specialized medication, needed things Amelia had no money to pay for. She worked from early morning until late at night, cleaning every corner, washing every piece of clothing, cooking every meal. Yet she didn't receive a single dollar. Everything was deducted from her father's debt. She had to beg for loose change from the men around the mansion to buy medicine for her mother, had to swallow humiliation and endure insults and contemptuous looks every day. Inside the Moretti mansion, Amelia lived like a ghost. She wasn't allowed to speak unless spoken to, wasn't allowed to look anyone in the eye, wasn't allowed to sit and rest if anyone could see her. The bodyguards treated her like an object, sometimes shouting at her simply because she crossed their path when they were in a bad mood. The other household staff, those who were paid and had days off, looked at her with a mix of pity and disdain, as if she were something dirty that shouldn't be touched. Amelia swallowed everything, hid her tears in dark corners, and told herself she had to endure for her mother, because someone still needed her. She didn't dare resist because she knew the consequences. She didn't dare run away because she knew they would find her and make her mother pay the price. Amelia Torres, at 27 years old, had lived 5 years as a slave, and she saw no escape ahead. Months ago, in a brief moment of desperate loneliness, Amelia had opened her heart to a man she thought would rescue her. But like everyone else in her life, he proved to be a coward, vanishing the moment he realized she was carrying his child, leaving her to face the burden of a second pregnancy alone while still bound to the Moretti debt. In the darkness of Amelia's life that seemed to offer no escape, there was one person who became the only light guiding her through her bleakest days. And that person was Isabella Moretti, the wife of the Mafia boss Amelia was forced to serve. They first met when Amelia had only been in the mansion for a few days, still trembling as she tried to learn her duties and avoid the hostile stares around her. Isabella found her crying alone in the laundry room, her thin shoulders shaking with each sob, and she did something no one else in that house had ever done. She sat down beside Amelia, placed a warm hand on her shoulder, and gently asked if she wanted to talk. From that moment on, Isabella became Amelia's quiet protector inside the cold walls of the mansion. She wasn't the arrogant woman Amelia had imagined a mafia boss's wife would be. Isabella was gentle, kind, and carried a loneliness only those abandoned by life could truly understand. She saw in Amelia a reflection of herself many years earlier, a young woman lost in a world too harsh for the fragile. Even knowing Amelia was repaying her father's debt, even knowing how low her status was in that house, Isabella treated her like a younger sister she had never had. Whenever a bodyguard shouted at Amelia without reason, Isabella would appear, and a single cold glance was enough to silence them. She was Gabriel Moretti's wife, and even if she didn't interfere in her husband's business, no one dared offend her. Isabella ordered the kitchen to prepare proper meals for Amelia, forced her to rest when she saw her exhausted, and sometimes pressed small amounts of money into her hand, saying it was for her mother's medicine. Amelia refused, saying she couldn't take her money, but Isabella only smiled and said it wasn't the Moretti family's money, it was her own, and she had the right to help anyone she chose. On afternoons when Gabriel was away, Isabella often called Amelia up to her room to talk. She brewed tea, cut cake, and treated Amelia like a friend, rather than a servant. In those intimate conversations, Isabella shared the pain she hid from everyone else. She and Gabriel had been married for 6 years but couldn't have children. They had tried everything, from fertility drugs to artificial insemination, and every attempt had ended in failure. Isabella cried as she spoke about the children she had once carried and lost, about cycles of hope followed by despair, about her fear that she would never become a mother. Amelia listened, held her hand, and for the first time understood that suffering didn't distinguish between rich and poor, that the woman living in this luxurious mansion also carried wounds money couldn't heal. Their bond was a secret they both kept. In front of Gabriel and the others, Amelia remained the silent maid and Isabella the dignified mistress of the house. But when they were alone, they were two kindred souls leaning on each other in a world too cold to survive alone. Isabella once told Amelia that no matter what happened, no matter what her secret was, she would always protect her. Amelia didn't understand those words at the time, but later she realized Isabella may have seen far more than she ever imagined. Then Isabella was gone, sudden and brutal, taking with her the only light in Amelia's life. On the day she was murdered, Amelia cried harder than she had at any time since her father's death. She lost her protector, her friend, the sister she had never dared to name out loud. From then on, Amelia became even more invisible in the Moretti mansion. She lowered her head further, spoke less, and learned how to turn herself into a ghost just to survive. But in her heart, the memory of Isabella remained untouched, along with the secret she swore to carry with her to the grave. That night, Gabriel Moretti did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He left the mansion alone, without bodyguards, without a driver, without telling anyone where he was going. Curiosity about the mysterious pregnant woman had gnawed at him for weeks, and he couldn't wait for another report from his men. He needed to see for himself, to understand how a maid who had worked for him for 5 years could be hiding such a profound secret. Marco had reported that Amelia lived in the southern slums, that no man ever visited her, but that information wasn't enough to answer the questions spiraling deeper and deeper in Gabriel's mind. He sat in his black Mercedes parked about 100 meters from the mansion's back gate, waiting for Amelia to finish her shift. The clock showed 9 in the evening when he saw her small figure step out through the servants' entrance. She wore an old gray coat worn thin at the shoulders, carried the same faded black bag she brought every day, her shoulders hunched against the early winter cold. Her belly was visibly round beneath the fabric, and Gabriel noticed she walked more slowly than usual, one hand supporting her lower back as if enduring constant pain. He started the engine, kept a safe distance, and began to follow her. Amelia walked to the bus stop about 10 minutes from the mansion, standing shivering in the cold darkness as she waited for the last bus of the day. Gabriel parked across the street, turned off the lights, and watched her through the windshield. He realized he had never truly looked at her before, never seen her as a human being. To him, Amelia had been part of the mansion's furnishings, a silent ghost who cleaned and vanished, nothing more. But now, watching her stand alone beneath the dim yellow streetlight with her pregnant belly and exhausted face, he wondered what her life was really like after she left the house he called home. The bus arrived. Amelia climbed aboard with visible effort, and Gabriel drove after it. The journey lasted nearly 2 hours, passing through neighborhoods that shifted from wealth to middle class, and then sank to the very bottom of society. He watched the scenery outside the window change from elegant homes with lush green lawns to gray apartment blocks with flickering streetlights, and finally to dark alleys piled with trash and homeless figures curled against damp walls. His Mercedes looked absurdly out of place here, like a diamond dropped into a garbage heap, but he didn't care. He had gone too far to turn back. Amelia got off at an uncovered stop, in front of a row of decrepit apartment buildings with peeling paint. She walked a few more minutes, turned into a pitch-dark alley lit by only a handful of weak bulbs, then entered the gate of a 5-story building that looked as if it might collapse at any moment. Gabriel parked at the mouth of the alley, stepped out, and followed her through the darkness. Rain began to fall, first as a light drizzle, then quickly turned into a heavy downpour as if the sky itself were breaking open. He had no umbrella, no raincoat, but he didn't return to the car. He stood in the rain, lifting his face to look at the crumbling building Amelia had just entered. Her apartment was on the 5th floor. Gabriel knew because he counted each level as he watched her shadow climb past the grimy windows. A few minutes later, a weak yellow light flickered on in the far right corner apartment, and he knew she was home. Rain soaked his expensive suit. Water streamed down his face. But Gabriel didn't move. He stood there like a statue, staring up at the small window, glowing faintly, wondering why a woman who worked 14 hours a day had to live in such misery. He knew she wasn't paid, knew she was repaying her father's debt, but seeing it with his own eyes stirred something strange inside him, something he couldn't name. Then he heard it. From the slightly open 5th floor window, drifting down through the sound of rain striking concrete, came a child's voice, clear, eager, filled with affection. the voice of a child calling for his mother. Gabriel's heart clenched as if squeezed by an invisible hand. Amelia had a child she had hidden for so many years. And that child, who was the father? Gabriel stood frozen in the pounding rain, his clothes soaked through long ago without him even noticing. Every sense he had was fixed on the small fifth-floor window from which the clear voice of a child had just drifted down. He moved closer, sheltering himself in the shadow of the opposite wall, straining to hear more clearly through the curtain of rain. Then he heard it, unmistakable and sharp, the voice of a little boy asking with eager excitement if his mother was home, calling out to her again and again. Amelia's voice answered, soft and warm in a way Gabriel had never once heard inside the mansion, telling him she was home, calling him Noah, praising him for being good, asking if he had waited long. Noah. The child's name was Noah. Gabriel repeated it silently, as if carving it into his memory. Amelia had a son, a child she had hidden through all those years working in his mansion. For 5 years she had come every morning and left every night, cleaning every corner, washing every shirt, cooking every meal, never once mentioning that she had a child. Not once had anyone seen the signs of a mother. She had been so perfect in her role as a silent maid that everyone forgot she had a life beyond the walls of the Moretti mansion. Gabriel's heart pounded hard in his chest, not from the cold but from a strange sensation he couldn't define. Why had she hidden this? Who was the child's father? How old was the boy? Questions spiraled through his mind without pause. He tried to calculate, tried to recall if there had been anything unusual over those 5 years that he had missed. There wasn't, because he had never truly looked at Amelia, never seen her as a person with feelings, with a past, with secrets. From the apartment above came the sound of a child's laughter, pure and innocent, as if the world held nothing to fear. Gabriel heard Amelia asking if her son had eaten, heard an older woman replying that the boy had already had dinner and bathed, heard Noah eagerly telling his mother about his day. It was the sound of a family, small and poor, but still a family, the very thing Gabriel had lost 3 years earlier, and believed he would never have again. He remained in the darkness for nearly another hour, until the light in the 5th-floor apartment switched off and the building fell into silence. The rain eased, leaving only water dripping from awnings into shallow puddles on the street. Gabriel turned back toward the Mercedes waiting at the mouth of the alley, his steps heavy as if burdened by 1,000 unanswered questions. He sat in the car without starting the engine, staring blankly at the steering wheel. That night, Gabriel Moretti couldn't sleep. He lay on the vast bed in the cold room, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling as images circled endlessly in his mind. Amelia with her growing pregnant belly, the decrepit apartment in the slums, the sound of a child calling for his mother. Who was Noah's father? Why had she hidden him? Why had she never asked for time off to be with her child? The questions haunted him like restless ghosts, and Gabriel knew he wouldn't find peace until he uncovered the truth. Tomorrow, he would investigate more thoroughly. He would find out who that child was and why his existence unsettled him so deeply. The next morning, Gabriel summoned Marco to his study the moment the sun began to rise. His loyal lieutenant looked at his boss with concern, because Gabriel's face was unlike anything he saw on ordinary days. No longer the familiar mask of cold detachment, but something closer to restless unease, as if something were gnawing at him from the inside. Gabriel gave his order curtly, his tone allowing no questions. He wanted Marco to break into Amelia's apartment while she was working at the mansion. He wanted to know everything about the child who lived there, and he wanted photographs. Marco nodded without a word, though confusion churned inside him as to why his boss would care about the child of a maid. At noon that day, while Amelia was busy cleaning the living room downstairs, Marco and 2 others arrived at the decrepit apartment complex in the southern part of Chicago. They climbed 5 flights of damp stairs, the wooden steps creaking beneath their weight, and stopped in front of apartment number 512. The old lock took less than 10 seconds to open, and they stepped into a cramped space where even daylight struggled to pass through the grimy windows. The apartment had 1 bedroom, a combined living room and kitchen, and a tiny bathroom with a rusted faucet. The walls were blotched with mold, the ceiling peeled in places to reveal bare cement, and the furniture was so worn it looked as though it had been bought secondhand or pulled straight from a dump. In the living room, an elderly woman sat on a frayed sofa, knitting needles in her hands, and in front of her a little boy played with a cheap plastic toy car. Marco recognized the woman immediately. It was Rosa, the former nanny who had once worked at the Moretti mansion many years earlier before retiring due to age and frailty. She looked at the unfamiliar men with fear, but when Marco raised a hand to signal they meant no harm, she silently pulled the child close to her chest. Marco stepped closer and crouched to look at the boy, and what he saw made his breath catch. The child looked up at him with clear blue eyes like an autumn lake, the same distinctive shade Marco had seen every day for 20 years serving the Moretti family. Gabriel's eyes. Marco hurriedly took photos of the boy from several angles, his hands trembling so badly he nearly dropped the phone. The child had thick black hair like Gabriel, a square jaw like Gabriel, a high bridge of the nose and facial lines that looked as if they had been carved from the same mold as the man Marco had sworn lifelong loyalty to. There was no mistaking it. No coincidence possible. This child was blood of the Moretti family. Marco asked Rosa how old the boy was, and she answered in a trembling voice that Noah had just turned 4 years old the previous month. 4 years old. Marco calculated quickly in his mind, and realized that meant the child had been conceived about 5 years earlier, at exactly the time Amelia began working at the mansion. When Marco returned and reported what he had seen, Gabriel said nothing. He took the phone, stared at the image of the child, and felt as though someone had driven a fist straight into his chest. Those blue eyes, he had seen them every morning in the mirror. That face, he had seen it in photographs of his own childhood. Noah did not merely resemble him. Noah was like a smaller version of himself from 30 years ago. It couldn't be, Gabriel told himself. It couldn't possibly be true, yet the proof lay right there before him, unmistakable and undeniable. Gabriel ordered Marco to secretly obtain a DNA sample from the child by any means necessary. A strand of hair, a toothbrush, anything at all. He needed to know the truth, needed to confirm what his heart had known from the instant he saw those blue eyes in the photograph. That night, Gabriel sat alone in his study, a bottle of whiskey in front of him, yet he didn't take a single drink. He stared at Noah's picture on his phone screen, then looked over at the wedding photo of himself and Isabella on the desk. Isabella had cried through countless nights because she couldn't give him a child, had blamed herself for every failed attempt at conception. But if this child was truly his, if he had had a son for 4 years without ever knowing, then what did that mean? How had it happened? And why had Amelia hidden it from him for all those years? 3 days later, the private physician of the Moretti family called to report that the test results were ready. Gabriel ordered him to come to the mansion immediately and to speak to no one about this matter. When the elderly doctor stepped into the study holding a white envelope, Gabriel realized his heart was pounding so hard he could hear it echoing in his ears. He snatched the envelope, tore it open, and read every line of the report without blinking. Probability of paternal blood relationship 99.99%. Noah was his biological son. Gabriel read that number over and over as if he couldn't trust his own eyes. 99.99%. Science had confirmed what his heart had known from the moment he saw the child's blue eyes in the photograph. He had a child. He had a 4-year-old son living in a rundown apartment in the slums, playing with cheap toys while his father sat here in a multi-million-dollar mansion, completely unaware of his existence. The paper trembled in Gabriel's hand, and he realized it was his own hands that were shaking. The most ruthless mafia boss in Chicago, a man who had killed countless enemies without a flicker of emotion, was now trembling over a DNA test result. He collapsed into the chair, his mind spinning with thousands of chaotic thoughts. Noah was 4 years old, which meant the child had been born around 4 years ago and conceived around 5 years ago. 5 years ago. When exactly was that? Gabriel dug through his memory, forcing himself to recall what had happened during that time. Then he remembered. 5 years ago was when Isabella was undergoing her 5th fertility treatment, the one they had placed all their hope in, only for it to fail like all the others. He remembered how shattered Isabella had been when the doctor announced the embryo hadn't developed, remembered her crying for days without stopping, remembered the helplessness that consumed him when he couldn't do anything to ease his wife's pain. But he didn't remember sleeping with Amelia. Gabriel searched every corner of his memory, trying to find any trace of how and when it might have happened. He remembered drinking heavily during that period, remembered long nights sitting alone in his study with a bottle of whiskey to drown the pain of failure, remembered the numbness as alcohol flooded his blood and washed every thought away. Had he done something during one of those drunken nights that he could no longer remember? Had he touched Amelia in a haze of alcohol, and then forgotten it all the next morning? Gabriel looked down at the test result again, the 99.99% seeming to mock him. He had had a child for 4 years without knowing, while Isabella died with the pain of never being able to become a mother. If she had known that her husband had a child with a maid under their own roof, how would she have felt? Would this truth have destroyed her or brought her joy? Gabriel didn't know, and he never would, because Isabella was no longer here for him to ask. Now he needed answers from the only person who could explain everything. Amelia had to tell him what had happened that night, why she hid the truth from him for 4 years, and why she chose to suffer in silence while raising his child alone in poverty. Gabriel clenched the test result in his fist, his jaw tightening, and he knew that the confrontation between him and Amelia was inevitable. That night, after receiving the DNA results, Gabriel sat alone in his study and tried to remember the fateful night 5 years earlier. The memory had been blurred by alcohol, but now that he knew the truth, scattered fragments began to surface slowly in his mind like damaged frames of an old film. 5 years ago, it had been the coldest winter Gabriel had ever endured, not because of the weather, but because the pain, freezing both his and Isabella's hearts, had been unbearable. They had attempted in vitro fertilization for the 5th time, this time with the best doctor, the most expensive medication, and the greatest hope they had ever dared to hold. Isabella had deprived herself of everything for months, not drinking a single drop of alcohol, not eating anything that might affect conception, praying every night as if God would surely hear her pleas, but God didn't listen. The doctor called on a Friday afternoon, his voice heavy as he explained that the embryo had stopped developing in the 6th week, that this was the 5th consecutive failure, and that they might need to consider other options, such as surrogacy or adoption. Isabella collapsed completely after the call. She cried as she never had before, her heart-wrenching sobs echoing through the mansion, and no one could comfort her. She locked herself in her room for days, didn't eat or drink, curled up on the bed, and cried until there were no tears left. Gabriel stood outside his wife's door, hearing her broken sobs through the thick wood, feeling like the most useless man alive. On the 3rd night after the news, Isabella took sleeping pills and fell into a deep sleep. Gabriel couldn't sleep. He went down to his study, opened the liquor cabinet, and began to drink. He didn't know when the 1st bottle ran dry, then the 2nd, then the 3rd. He drank as if trying to drown his pain in alcohol, drank until the room began to spin, until he could no longer tell what was real and what was not. He thought of Isabella, of the child they would never have, of the endless cycles of hope and disappointment, of the helplessness of watching his wife shatter while being unable to do anything. He smashed a glass against the wall, hurled a whiskey bottle onto the floor, screamed in drunken madness like a man losing his sanity. The noise woke someone. Amelia, the maid who had been working there only a few months, was sent in by a bodyguard to clean up the mess in the boss's study. She entered the dark room, lit only by a weak desk lamp, and saw Gabriel slumped on the floor amid broken glass, a nearly empty bottle in his hand, eyes red and unfocused. She bent down to gather the shards, trying to make no sound so as not to disturb him. But in his drunken haze, Gabriel looked up and saw the figure of a woman in the dim light. Long black hair like Isabella's, a slender frame like Isabella's, and with his mind numbed by alcohol, he believed it was Isabella. He called his wife's name, his voice choked with pain. He reached out, grabbed the woman's wrist, and pulled her close. Amelia froze in terror, not knowing what to do. She wasn't Isabella. She wanted to say it, but the words stuck in her throat. Gabriel held her, whispering words of love meant for his wife, apologizing for failing to give her a child, apologizing for everything. His tears fell onto her shoulder, and Amelia realized that this ruthless mafia boss was also just a man breaking apart from grief. She wanted to push him away, wanted to tell him she wasn't his wife, but she was afraid. She feared his reaction in his drunken state, feared he would erupt in rage and turn his fury on her, feared he would throw her out and she would have no way to repay her father's debt. Amelia was only 22, a young woman who had never been touched by anyone, and she didn't know how to handle what was happening. When Gabriel kissed her, when he laid her down on the sofa in the corner of the room, when what followed unfolded like a nightmare she couldn't escape, Amelia could only close her eyes and pray for it to end quickly. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She lay still like a lifeless doll and endured. The next morning, when Gabriel woke on the sofa with a splitting headache, he remembered nothing of the previous night, except that he had drunk far too much. The room had been completely cleaned, no trace left of broken glass or empty bottles. He assumed someone had tidied up while he slept and didn't bother asking who. He had more important things to worry about, like how to help Isabella survive this blow. He had no idea what he had done the night before, no idea that the woman in his arms hadn't been his wife, and no idea that a small life had begun forming inside the silent maid. As for Amelia, she woke in the small basement room reserved for servants, looked into the mirror and saw a stranger staring back. She showered, put on her uniform, and went to work as if nothing had happened. She told no one, didn't cry out, didn't accuse, because she knew no one would believe a maid repaying a debt, because she knew that if she spoke she would be the one blamed, and because she knew that in this world, the weak had no right to justice. Amelia swallowed her pain and continued living, until 2 months later, when she discovered she was pregnant and realized that the fateful night had left a mark that could never be erased. That evening, after the mansion had fallen into silence and most of the staff had retreated to their rooms, Gabriel instructed Marco to bring Amelia to his study. The room was shrouded in darkness, lit only by a small desk lamp that cast a dull yellow glow and painted strange shadows along the walls. Gabriel sat behind the black oak desk, his face swallowed by shadow, with only his cold blue eyes glinting like those of a predator watching its prey. On the desk before him lay the DNA test result, motionless and heavy, like a death sentence waiting to be read aloud. He had waited for this moment all day, had prepared thousands of questions in his mind. Yet when the knock sounded and Amelia stepped inside, he realized he still wasn't ready to face the truth. Amelia entered with her usual timid posture, head bowed, eyes fixed on the floor, hands clasped in front of her ever-growing belly. She didn't know why her employer had summoned her at this hour, but the instinct of someone who had lived in fear for 5 years told her something was terribly wrong. Her heart pounded violently in her chest as she stood before Gabriel's desk, waiting for him to speak. The silence stretched until it became suffocating, broken only by the steady ticking of the wall clock, as if counting down to an unavoidable disaster. Then Gabriel spoke, his voice low and icy. He asked her if she knew why he had called her here. Amelia shook her head, her voice trembling as she said she didn't know. Gabriel said nothing more. He simply picked up the paper on the desk and threw it toward her. It spun through the air before landing at Amelia's feet, face up on the floor, the bold printed lines clearly visible beneath the lamp's glow. Amelia bent down to pick it up, and the instant her eyes caught the numbers, 99.99%. The instant she read the confirmation of a paternal blood relationship, her entire world collapsed. The paper slipped from her fingers. Her legs buckled as if all strength had been drained from her body. Amelia fell to her knees on the cold floor, tears spilling uncontrollably. She had known this day would come, had feared it for 5 long years, and now it was here. Gabriel knew. He knew Noah was his son. He knew she had hidden the truth from him for 4 years. And from everything she knew about this man, about his merciless cruelty, she was certain she would die tonight. She wasn't afraid of death. She was afraid for Noah, afraid for her little boy sleeping peacefully in a rundown apartment, unaware that his mother might never return. She crawled toward Gabriel's desk, knelt, pressed her hands together as if in prayer, and begged through choking sobs. She asked him to kill her if he wished, to punish her in any way he saw fit, but pleaded that he not touch Noah. The child was innocent. He knew nothing. He had done nothing wrong. She was willing to accept any punishment, willing to die right there if that was what he wanted, as long as he promised Noah would be left in peace. Amelia cried as she never had before, her broken sobs echoing through the dark room, and for the first time in 3 years, Gabriel saw a woman crying before him who wasn't Isabella. Gabriel rose, walked around the desk, and stopped in front of Amelia as she knelt on the floor. He looked down at her from above, his face revealing no emotion, while inside him a storm raged. He asked why she had hidden it from him, why she hadn't told him from the beginning, why she had chosen to raise the child alone in poverty, instead of coming to him and demanding what the child deserved. His voice didn't shout or snarl. It was cold and even, as if he were asking about a business report, and that calm was more terrifying than any outburst of rage. Amelia looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen from crying, and she began to tell her story. She spoke of that night, of how he had been so drunk he mistook her for Isabella, of how she had been too afraid to resist or speak. She told him how she discovered she was pregnant 2 months later, of the panic when she realized she was carrying the child of a married Mafia boss. She spoke of considering an abortion but having no money, and then of how, when her belly began to grow, she had no choice but to keep the baby. She told him about Isabella, about how she had discovered the pregnancy, and asked who the father was. Gabriel asked what she had told Isabella. Amelia lowered her head, her voice a whisper as if afraid someone might hear. She said she had lied. She told Isabella she had been attacked by a stranger on the street while walking home late from work. She hadn't dared tell the truth because she knew Isabella was suffering from being unable to have children. She couldn't tell her that her husband had gotten her pregnant, even if it had happened while he was drunk. She feared the truth would destroy Isabella, would shatter their marriage, would wound her so deeply she might never recover. And after Isabella died, she was even more afraid to speak, because she feared Gabriel would kill her, would take Noah away, would never let her see her child again. Amelia sobbed uncontrollably, her entire body trembling like a leaf in a storm. She said she was sorry for hiding the truth, sorry for letting Noah grow up without a father, sorry for everything. But she begged him to understand her. She was only a weak woman trying to protect her child in a world that was brutally cruel to people like her. She had no power, no money, no one on her side. All she could do was remain silent and endure, because that was the only way she and Noah could survive. Gabriel stood in silence as he listened to Amelia speak, his face still cold as stone, yet something had begun to waver in his eyes. When she finished, he thought he finally knew the whole truth, but Amelia hesitated, then said there was one more thing she had to tell him. Trembling, she stood up, asked his permission to retrieve something, and stepped out of the room. A few minutes later, she returned, holding an old, yellowed envelope, one she had guarded like a treasure for 3 years. She placed it on the desk in front of Gabriel, and said it was something Isabella had entrusted to her before she died, with instructions to give it to Gabriel only when he learned the truth about Noah. Gabriel stared at the envelope and instantly recognized his wife's familiar handwriting on its surface. His name was written in blue ink, the strokes soft and graceful, just like Isabella herself. His hand shook as he picked it up, and it took him several seconds to steady himself before opening it. Inside was a long letter spanning 2 pages, handwritten carefully on the lightly scented paper Isabella always used. He began to read, and each word felt like a blade cutting into his hardened heart. Isabella wrote that she knew the truth. She had never believed Amelia's story about being attacked by a stranger, because she knew Amelia never came home late, because she knew the girl was too gentle and timid to lie convincingly. Isabella had quietly watched, had asked the family physician to take a DNA sample from Noah when the child was newly born, and she had known the result before Noah turned 1 year old. Noah was Gabriel's son, his blood, the child she had longed for over so many years but could never have. Gabriel had to stop reading for a moment as his vision blurred. Gabriel couldn't believe Isabella had known the truth from the moment Noah was born until her final breath without saying a single word. She had lived with that secret, watching Amelia work every day in the mansion, and knowing her husband had a child with another woman. Yet she chose silence to protect the fragile peace of their home. Why? He kept reading to find the answer. Isabella wrote that she wasn't angry with Gabriel, because she knew that night he didn't know what he was doing. She knew he had been drunk beyond awareness. She knew he had been broken by the pain of not being able to give her a child, and she knew he would never have betrayed her intentionally. She also wasn't angry with Amelia, because she knew the girl had no choice, no right to refuse, and had endured everything alone in silence for years. If there was anyone to blame, Isabella wrote, it was fate itself, the destiny that had arranged a tragedy none of them had ever wanted. But what choked Gabriel the most were the final lines of the letter. Isabella wrote that she had prayed for years to give him a child, and even if that miracle hadn't come from her, it had still come. Noah was that miracle, the answer to her prayers, even if it arrived in a way no one could have imagined. She wrote that if she couldn't be the child's mother, she could at least protect him from afar, could help Amelia raise him without anyone knowing. She wrote that she loved Gabriel, loved him enough to accept everything, even watching his child grow up without ever being able to call him her own. And at the end of the letter, as if she had sensed what was coming, Isabella wrote that if one day she was no longer by his side, she wanted him to find Noah, to be the child's father, to give him what he deserved. She wrote that she wanted Gabriel to be happy, wanted him to have a family, and if the woman who brought him that happiness was Amelia, then she accepted it. She wrote that she forgave everything, and she only wished he wouldn't live in darkness forever. The final line of the letter was written in uneven strokes, as if Isabella had been crying when she wrote it, saying, I love you, Gabriel, please live a happy life for me. Gabriel finished reading and collapsed into the chair. The paper slipped from his hand and drifted softly to the floor like a dry leaf. And then, for the first time in 3 years since Isabella's death, the most ruthless mafia boss in Chicago cried, not with sobs, not with screams of agony, but with silent tears streaming down his hardened face, tears he believed had dried up long ago. He cried for Isabella, for the boundless love she had given him, for the quiet sacrifice she had carried for so many years. Amelia stood frozen in the corner of the room, crying as well, and for the first time she saw the real Gabriel Moretti, not the terrifying mafia boss, but a man shattered by the loss of the woman who had loved him more than anyone else in the world. 2 days after that confrontation, Gabriel decided to meet his son. This time he didn't watch from a distance, didn't stand in the rain staring up at a window like a stranger. He drove to the rundown apartment complex in the southern part of Chicago on a weekend afternoon, when Amelia was home with Noah. She knew he was coming. He had called ahead, and she had spent the entire night preparing herself for the moment she both longed for and feared. Gabriel climbed the 5 flights of worn stairs, hearing the steps creak beneath his expensive leather shoes, his heart pounding harder than it ever had in his life. He had faced hundreds of enemies, stared down gun barrels without flinching. Yet now, standing before the door of the apartment where his son lived, his legs felt heavy as if weighted with stone. Amelia opened the door, her face tense but trying to remain calm. She stepped aside to let Gabriel in, and he saw the small apartment where his child had lived for 4 years. It was even more miserable than he had imagined from the outside, with walls stained by damp patches, battered furniture crudely patched together, and weak light filtering through dust-covered windows. But Gabriel had no time to take it in, because in the middle of the living room, a little boy sat on the floor playing with a plastic toy car, and that child looked up at him with clear blue eyes. Noah studied the tall stranger with the curiosity of a 4-year-old. He wasn't afraid, didn't hide. He simply tilted his head and asked in a bright voice who the man was and why he had come to his house. Gabriel froze, his throat tightening until no words would come. He looked at the child, at the thick black hair so much like his own, at the square chin and high bridge of the nose copied from his face, and something inside his chest shattered and knit itself back together all at once. This was his son, his flesh and blood, the child he had dreamed of for so many years with Isabella. He slowly knelt so his eyes were level with Noah's, his voice rough as he answered that he was a friend of his mother. Noah considered him for a moment, as if deciding whether to trust this stranger, then broke into a wide grin and turned back to his toy. He held up the car proudly and told Gabriel it was his, that his mother had bought it a long time ago, but one of the wheels was broken and it didn't run anymore. Gabriel looked at the cheap plastic car with its cracked wheel and peeling paint, and his heart clenched painfully. The son of the richest mafia boss in Chicago was playing with a broken toy that Amelia had likely bought secondhand with the little money she could beg from people at the mansion. Gabriel reached out and gently took the car from Noah's hands, turning it over as if it were the most precious thing in the world. He told the boy he would buy him a new car, the most beautiful one, the fastest one. Noah's eyes widened, his face lighting up with joy as he asked if it was really true, and said his mother had told him she didn't have money to buy a new one. The innocent words of a 4-year-old pierced Gabriel's heart like a blade. He glanced at Amelia, standing in the corner, saw her biting her lip to hold back tears, and understood that she had sacrificed everything to raise his child while he lived in luxury without ever knowing. Noah suddenly reached up and touched Gabriel's face, his small fingers brushing the man's cheek, and asked with simple wonder why his eyes looked like Noah's, because his mother had said blue eyes were very rare. Gabriel took his son's tiny hand and held it in his palm, feeling how fragile it was, as if it could break if he squeezed too hard. This was his child, carrying his blood, and he had missed the first 4 years of his life. He couldn't reclaim the years already lost, but he swore to himself that from this moment on, he wouldn't let Noah lack for anything ever again. After that first afternoon with Noah, Gabriel returned to the mansion with his mind in turmoil and a decision already taking shape. He couldn't allow his son to continue living in a rundown apartment in the slums, couldn't allow a child carrying the Moretti bloodline to grow up in deprivation and poverty. He summoned Amelia to the mansion that very evening, after Rosa had taken care of Noah, and informed her of his decision in a voice that allowed no refusal. He wanted her and Noah to move into the mansion immediately, to live in their own private rooms with every comfort, and Noah would be treated as the official heir of the Moretti family. It was an order, not an offer. But Amelia did something no one in the Moretti family had ever dared to do. She refused. She stood before Gabriel with determined eyes despite her trembling voice, and told him directly that she didn't want her son to grow up in that world. She didn't want Noah to know his father was a mafia boss, didn't want him to see armed guards walking through the house, didn't want him to hear meetings about killing or weapons trafficking. She wanted Noah to have a normal childhood, to attend a normal school, to play with normal children, and to grow into a decent man, rather than a criminal like his father. Gabriel was so furious he slammed his hand on the desk, sending a glass crashing to the floor and shattering. He roared at Amelia, demanding to know who she thought she was to